Hey, what's up? It's Stu. Been another while since my last Star Rail video, took a detour working on some FGO videos in the meantime. It's also a little awkward how late this video is because Danhung Alter is out right now and I'll make a video on him too as soon as I can, but for now, 4 weeks late, here's a guide on how to play Star Rail's premier waifu, Kafka. Kafka is a 5-star Nihility character who was technically always in the game since launch because she shows up in the prologue but became fully playable with the second half of 1.2, and she gaslit 3/4 of Star Rail's current player base into continuing to play the game with a single word. The fact that she gives off hella Makima vibes may or may not also be a factor. The TLDR is this: Kafka is a strong lightning DPS who relies on putting shock DOTs on enemies and then detonating them for consistent damage, and she's flexible enough to cover a range of DPS roles quite comfortably in case her thighs didn't make that obvious enough. These, along with the fact that DOTs in Star Rail do not crit, make Kafka one of the easiest 5-star characters to build and use, and thus she's one of the most free-to-play friendly characters in the whole game, which is quite fitting for Star Rail's most popular waifu. As usual, let's take a look at her stats first. She's got 1086 HP, 679 attack, 485 defense, and 100 speed flat. These stats are very similar actually to her girlfriend Silverwolf's, with Kafka having slightly more HP, attack, and defense in exchange for lower speed. Surprisingly, she's got even higher attack than Selly, and this high attack stat is perfect for Kafka given that she relies on DOTs, and her DOTs scale off of her attack. Moving on to her kit, starting with her skill, Caressing Moonlight, you'll also notice that Kafka's kit sounding kinda thirsty themselves will be a recurring theme here. In any case, it's a splash attack that deals 80 to 200% of her attack to its main target, and 30 to 75% of her attack to enemies on both sides of that main target. But the juiciest effect is that it immediately causes all DOTs that its main target currently has to deal 1 tick of additional damage equal to 60 to 82.5% of their original damage. This is what we mean when we say that Kafka, quote, detonates DOTs on enemies. And remember, this is for all DOTs, not just the ones that Kafka puts on enemies herself. Her ultimate, Twilight Trill, is an AoE that deals 48 to 96% of her attack to all enemies with a 100% base chance to shock them for 2 turns. When they get shocked from Kafka's ult specifically, that shock instantly does 80 to 110% of its original damage to them too, and while enemies have this shock, they take 116 to 360.69%, nice, of Kafka's attack as DOT damage at the start of their turns. Her talent, Gentle but Cruel, which is perfect for anyone who's interested in studying the soles of her boots a little too much, allows her to follow-up attack any enemy that any of her teammates uses a basic attack on. This follow-up attack does 42 to 189% of her attack to them, and also has a 100% base chance to shock them for 2 turns. Of note, this shock is the same one that her ult puts on enemies too. However, Kafka can only use this follow-up attack once a turn. And her technique is Mercy is Not Forgiveness, which has her throw out her spider strings, or whatever they are, all around herself, and they'll hit any enemy in range in an AoE. If it hits an enemy, she'll deal 50% of her attack as damage to all enemies, even if they aren't weak to lightning, with again a 100% base chance to put the same shock DOT that her ult has onto them for 2 turns. Even though it's an AoE, Kafka's technique doesn't actually hit multiple enemies at once, even if they're all in range. Instead, what it'll do is it'll prioritize the enemy with lightning weakness, so that way you can start the fight with the bigger advantage, that is, against the enemy wave that Kafka can break with lightning. This technique can be quite convenient, since in Star Rail, when you run into 2 or more enemies at once, sometimes it can be kind of annoying trying to target the enemy with the element that you want to use to break them with, which is another common gacha game L that you can't frickin' aim. Kafka lets you not have to worry about that by just auto-targeting the one that does have lightning weakness, so all you gotta worry about is making sure that at least one of those enemies in a group has lightning weakness, and you're good to go. And lastly, let's go over her traces. The bonus stats she gets are EHR, attack, and HP, all 3 of which are great, even the HP, since that increases her survivability in high-level MOC. Her 3 bonus abilities are Torture, which causes her ult to blow up all DOTs just like her skill, Plunder, which gives Kafka an extra 5 energy whenever an enemy is killed while shocked, and Kafka doesn't have to be the one to kill them herself to get that extra energy, and Thorns, which increases the base chance for the shock that her ult, technique, and follow-up puts on enemies by 30%. 100%. All 3 of her bonus abilities are integral to Kafka's gameplay, so unlock them all at the same time if you can. If you can't though, prioritize Thorns first, then Plunder for more frequent ults, and then Torture, though Torture should be easy to unlock first anyway since it's her first bonus ability and thus doesn't require a Track of Destiny. And for her regular abilities, level her ultimate first, then skill, and then talent in that order. You don't really have to level her basics since there's nothing in her kit that incentivizes you to use it, and you want Kaf to use her skill as much as possible anyway. Kitty Cat's game plan, just like anyone who simps for her, which includes me for real, is quite simple. She wants to put her shock DOT on enemies and keep slamming them over and over with her ult and skill so she can keep blowing them up with her DOT explosions because she clearly didn't have enough innuendos already. This is made even more simple thanks to the fact that DOTs cannot crit in Star Rail, which means that a standard Kafka build, which I like to call Dotka, does not give a shit about crit stats at all. Matter of fact, Dotka almost doesn't really care for substats in general much either, but we'll discuss that later when we talk about her relics. For now, all you need to know is that as long as you give Dotka the right main stats on her relics, she's pretty much good to go. So kinda like her buddy Blade, Kafka's more interested in the kind of team you can put together for her. Because both her skill and ult can blow up DOTs, that means that she can make a dedicated DOT team viable in harder content and almost single-handedly validates the Nihility path in Simulated Universe because, let's be honest, who the fuck ran Nihility before Kafka was playable? The 2 DOT teammates that Kafka can work with are Sampo and Luca. Run Sampo if you're up against groups of enemies or double bosses, but because Kafka is surprisingly good even against single target enemies or bosses, this means that Luca can also be a good teammate for her since he's also single target and puts a 3-turn bleed on his target with his skill. He can also use his skill pretty flexibly, again to let Kafka hog more of the skill points so she can keep slaying like the absolute queen that she is. Unfortunately, from my understanding, there's not really much of a point running Serval with Kafka since Kafka should be able to maintain full shock uptime on her own. It's not that Serval doesn't work with Kafka. Kafka can still detonate the shock DOTs that Serval puts on enemies herself. It's just that you might as well run other DOT characters for more elemental variety. I would advise against running Kafka with more than one DOT teammate though, because ideally you should have either a buffer or a debuffer and a healer to round out Kafka's team. Speaking of debuffers, keep in mind that things like defense debuffs and damage buffs also affect DOT damage, so Asta and Pella come to mind. You can also run Hypercarry Kafka with Tingyun, Bronya, or Silverwolf, though Dotka can't really use Bronya's crit damage buff much. Speaking of Hypercarry, you don't even have to run Kafka with another DOT teammate. She can function perfectly well as the only DOT character on her team, since her kit is self-sustainable with 2 ways to put shock DOTs on enemies and 2 ways to blow them up. In fact, Kafka is strong enough to on her own when built properly that she can function as whatever you need her as, either a main DPS or hypercarry or a sub DPS or breaker if you need a lightning breaker on one of your MOC teams. Let's talk Lycones now. She's got a ton of options which further cements her status as a very easy character to build and equip. Naturally, Patience, which is her gacha 5-star Lycone, is her best one, but she can use most 4-star Lycones with the sole exception of Tutorial Mission. She can also use Welt's Lycone and even Silverwolf's Lycone if you happen to have them, and Solitary Healing, the newest free 5-star Lycone in Simulated Universe, means that you never have to kill your brain cells ever again, seeing how utterly pointless the 3-star Nihility Lycones are for Kafka, so use whatever you can get or already have on your account. Now onto her relics. As absolutely dog shit as the 4-piece lightning set is, it's actually Kafka's best relic set, and I'm pretty sure I've said in one of my previous Star Rail videos that it was probably balanced around Kafka specifically anyway. If you never bothered farming lightning pieces, not that I blame you, especially ever since the Star Rail player base realized that Genuine was not as good as they thought he'd be, then 2-piece Musketeer and 2-piece Lightning is good enough. It's basically the same as 4-piece Lightning anyway, just with less attack. If you want to run Kit Kat with her roommate Silverwolf because in your headcanon they're besties, this opens up 4-piece Quantum set for Kafka since a daily reminder the Quantum set has the best 4-piece relic Relic set effect in the entire game for literally no reason, and Silverwolf can put lightning weakness on enemies with quantum weakness, so that they'll get their asses smacked by the double whammy of quantum set's defense pierce and lightning weakness bonus damage, though to be fair this applies to literally any other DPS you want to run with Silverwolf anyway. Space Sealing Station is by far her best 2-piece ornament set since it gives straight attack buffs, and that's all Kafka normally cares about. For main stats you want speed boots, attack body, lightning planar, and attack rope. However, you can run attack boots instead of speed if you have patience, or gacha light cone that is, since it gives you up to 3 speed stacks that can dramatically increase your speed on its own, or you roll so many speed substats that Kaf's able to hit 120 speed on her own anyway. Do not put EHR body on Kafka. That's a waste of a body piece, since not only is she getting a lot of EHR from her traces anyway, and her Thorn's ability, but you're also foregoing the 43% attack that she would get from running attack body instead, especially if you have to run speed boots. She does need 28% EHR in total to guarantee her shocks on enemies with high effect res, but she already gives herself, again, that 18% as free stats from her trace tree, so all you gotta do is find like 10% EHR from her substats, meaning EHR body is gonna be complete overkill and hella suboptimal. In my how to prep for Kafka video that I put out a week before she came out, I guessed that she might want energy rope since her ult is 120 energy, and it seemed like it'd be pretty powerful, but it turns out she doesn't need that extra energy regen at all, since she can build her ult pretty fast anyway on her own between her plunder bonus and the extra energy she gets off of all the follow-up attacks that she does over the course of a fight. Attack ropes are a lot more common than energy ropes anyway, so thankfully it works out. For substats, make sure to get that last 10% EHR that I was talking about earlier so that Kafka can guarantee her shocks, though it's only 10%, so you don't need a lot of EHR rolls in the first place. Otherwise, attack and speed especially if you're trying to go for that super fast Kafka build with like E4 Asta or something, followed by break effect, HP percent, and effect res. And again, you do not need any crit stats at all for Kafka, and in fact, building Kafka with crit stats, or what I like to call critka as opposed to dotka, seems to be a little pointless since she doesn't scale well with crit stats, and it's so much easier to build her when you don't have to maul over RNG crit rolls for 2 weeks straight or longer. So you can go for a critka build, just do so at your own risk. And finally, her Eidolons. All of Kat's Eidolons are pretty ridiculous. Her E1 gives her follow-ups a 100% base chance to increase DOT damage taken by its target by 30% for 2 turns. Her E2 increases the dot damage dealt by all allies on her team by 25% just by being on the field, and that includes herself too. Her E4 generates 2 extra energy every time an enemy takes damage from her shock, which lets her spam her ult even more, and her E6 increases her shock damage multiplier by 156% and makes her shock last for 1 more turn. Honestly, I feel like her E4 and E6 aren't even that necessary. Her E1 and E2 are pretty crazy already as they are, but Kafka functions perfectly fine even at E0, which is consistent with her being one of the most free-to-play friendly characters in the game. So in summary, Kafi is a fantastic dot DPS who commits elemental terrorism by blowing up DOTs that enemies have that she or her teammates put on them first. She's extremely easy to use and build, with a ton of light cone options, including a free 5-star one that's now in her to store that's almost tailor-made for her anyway. And true to her personality, she doesn't care who she's fighting with for the most part, as long as she gets to blow people up, making her one of the 2 queens of free-to-play friendly 5-stars, the other one appropriately being her bestie Silverwolf. Make sure to show her some Studio Ghibli films, because there's no way she's not a closet weeb with that katana she carries around with her, and introduce her to Aki from Street Fighter sometime, so that way you can have 2 waifus whom you can't fix, but can definitely fix you. And never forget what MiHoYo took away from us! If you found the video informative, useful, or just downright degenerate because of my slight obsession with Kafka's thighs, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for future Star Rail videos. And if there's anything I've missed, feel free to share any extra Kafka info in the comments for me and others to learn. Make sure to check me out over at my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/ToaSniper98. Stop by if you have any further questions about Kafka, or Star Rail, or gachas in general. Thanks for watching. Peace.